My name is Mark Porch and I'm the Chief Executive of Brace Dementia Research. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Brace and also our partners in arranging this webinar, Greg Latcham Solicitors. With our different perspectives on the cruel condition that is dementia, we know how difficult and stressful it can be to live with dementia and to have to cope with caring for somebody with the condition, or to anticipate the challenges of dementia by preparing wisely for the unknown. We have two excellent speakers to help navigate through what dementia is, how it affects people's lives, and how we can plan to mitigate some of the worst consequences through legal protection. Before I introduce them though, it's a little bit of housekeeping to do. Usually when I welcome people to meetings and say a little bit of housekeeping, it's telling them where the fire exits are and how they can find the toilets. Now, I don't need to do that for you this morning, I hope, and I wouldn't know anyway, but there are a couple of bits of housekeeping relating to the virtual building we're in, which is called Zoom. And as I found myself this morning, you can have the odd technical hitch. First of all, we're going to have a Q&A later. If you want to ask a question, it might well occur to you in the middle of someone's talk. Rather than have to write it down and then put your hand up later on, the easiest way to make sure that it's picked up is to use the chat facility at the bottom of the screen. Now, if you're used to Zoom, you'll know exactly where to go. If not, if you look at the bottom of the screen, and if it's not showing, just give your mouse a nudge. You'll see the word chat. And if you click on that, it will give you a panel into which you can type your question. That will be visible to everybody else, but most importantly, it'll be visible to Joe from Greg Latcham's, who is working away behind the scenes, and she'll gather up all your questions and make sure that the panel answers as many of them as possible. The other bit of housekeeping is to do with what you can see on the screen. You're probably looking at an array of faces at the moment and some black rectangles as well, with people's names on them. When our first main speaker starts, though, you'll get a slide come up and probably a little panel with a few faces in it, and that panel could get in the way of part of the slide. If you're used to Zoom, you'll know what to do. If you're not, just look at the top of that panel and you'll find some little symbols, the second from the left of which is the speaker view. If you select that, you will have just the one thumbnail picture of the speaker and you'll be able to see probably all of the slide. Now, before I introduce the speakers, I'm just going to tell you very briefly what Brace does, because we might be a name that's unfamiliar to many of you. We're a dementia research charity. We raise funds and we award grants for research focused on understanding the causes of dementia, achieving earlier diagnosis, and developing new and more potent treatments. We've been going for 33 years, and despite being a small West Country charity, we've played a role in many of the advances that have been achieved in that time. And we also provide information events, drawing on the knowledge that's being gathered through research to help deepen the public understanding of dementia, and that's why we're here with you this morning. Now to our speakers. The second speaker will be Heledd Wyn, who is a solicitor at Greg Latcham's, who's also their firm's head of long-term and elderly care. She happens also to be a trustee of Brace, where her legal insights and understanding of the impact of dementia are an invaluable asset to us. Before Heledd speaks, however, we're going to hear from Dr. James Selwood. Now, James is a member of the clinical research team at the Bristol Brain Centre at Southmead Hospital, where he's involved with both the NHS dementia patient care, but also the research that goes on in that facility around patients and volunteers. Some of the work has been funded by Brace, which also part-funded the creation of the Brain Centre itself. So without further ado, I'm now going to hand over to James to explain to us more about dementia itself. Thank you, James.
Thanks, Mark. So I'm now going to try and share my screen. Hopefully this will be straightforward. Okay. Right. Okay. So yeah, thanks again, Mark. So I'm going to talk about dealing with dementia. I'm going to be doing that from a very sort of clinical perspective in this talk. So I'm a research fellow. So basically my work is split between NHS care, so I run a clinic on a Tuesday afternoon, and most of the rest of my time is spent doing research. So I work with a team of other doctors who are consultant neurologists. I'm not a consultant myself, and I'm not a neurologist either. And my training was actually in psychiatry, so I have perhaps a slightly different approach in some ways to sort of dementia, but of course we are all sort of aiming towards the same goal of diagnosing people and treating people as best we can with the tools available. So in terms of what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk a little bit about obviously what dementia is, how we diagnose it. I'll then talk about the common types of dementia we encounter in clinics, so Alzheimer's, vascular and Lewy body dementia, and I'll finish with an overview of frontotemporal dementia as well. And then the last slide will be a brief overview of what you can do to help someone you encounter who has a dementia diagnosis. Now, so I've got about half an hour. I could talk for a lot longer than half an hour about all these different things. So I will be keeping things fairly brief and concise, but obviously there is, as Mark mentioned, a chance to ask questions as well. And I will do my best to answer as many of those as I can at the end when we've finished talking. So, first of all, before going into what dementia is, I think a good starting point is to talk about what the brain is and how it and how that works. So, just to orientate yourselves, so on the left side of the screen in red, you'll see the frontal lobe in red. So this is the front part of the brain, as the name suggests, and this is really important for decision making, problem solving. It regulates our personality and behaviour. It also includes an important area that's required for speech production. Towards the back part of the frontal lobe, I don't know if you can see my cursor there, you've got an important motor area. So that's responsible for our bodily movements, basically. Behind the frontal lobe, we've got the parietal lobe. So this is really important for orientation. It also contains the area responsible for receiving sensory information from the rest of the body. Below that, in blue, we have the temporal lobe. So this is important for processing information coming through our ears, so auditory information, understanding language. And although you can't see it on this diagram, deep within inside the temporal lobe, you've got a part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is really important for making new memories and learning new information. And we'll talk more about that, particularly in the context of Alzheimer's disease. Towards the back part of the brain, we've got the occipital lobe, which is primarily there for visual information processing. So the information that comes through our eyes is processed at that back part of the brain. The other parts of the diagram, which I won't dwell on too much, are the cerebellum. So this is important for balance and coordinating movements. And then we also have the brainstem, which is responsible for a lot of what we call autonomic functions. So things that you don't really have to consciously think about. So things like breathing, body temperature, and our swallowing. So the key thing to take away from this slide is not to remember, you don't have to remember exactly what all these different parts of the brain do. The key message here is that the brain has a sort of division of labour. So different parts of the brain do different things. Okay. So what is dementia? So dementia is very much an umbrella term which describes a whole range of different symptoms so associated with a decline in cognitive function. I'll use the term cognition and cognitive quite a lot in this talk, and what we're basically talking about is memory and thinking. Okay. On this diagram, you can see the four most common types of dementia, which I'm going to talk about. So as you can see, Alzheimer's is the most common one. It's the one that people, tend to think about when you hear the term dementia. But of course, there are these other diseases which cause dementia. So we have vascular disease, Lewy body disease, and frontotemporal. There are actually many, many other different types of dementia. Some of them I perhaps wouldn't even know that much about. We're talking about, hundreds of different conditions that can cause dementia. But yeah, these are the four I'm going to be focusing on in this talk. So I've already sort of told you what the main feature of dementia is. So a decline in cognitive function, so memory and thinking ability. But what we're also saying when we use the term dementia is that the problems with cognition are such that they are starting to impact on a person's activities of daily living. So they may, for example, no longer be able to drive. They may be struggling to complete chores around the home because their cognitive function is impaired to that sort of degree. Unfortunately, dementia is, of course, a progressive condition. It does get worse over time. And related to that point, we don't have a cure. So we do have some medicines which can be helpful for the symptoms of different types of dementia. But there's nothing which actually slows the progress of dementia. Obviously, there's a lot of research going on to try and find new treatments which can slow progress of dementia. So again, hence why research is so very, very important. So how do we diagnose dementia? So there are a few different components which we use to build a picture of what's going on. So when a person comes to clinic after being referred by their GP, they'll have a clinical assessment with me or another clinician. And what we will do is we'll take a history of their problems. We'll find out how their memory and thinking difficulties are impacting on their day-to-day lives. It's also really helpful to get a bit of a picture from someone who knows the person well, so usually their husband or wife or another family member or close friend. And what we also do as part of that process at their initial assessment is, within our clinic, we will do a whole range of blood tests, which are primarily there to look for other things that might be causing problems with memory and thinking. So simply having a problem with memory or thinking does not mean you have dementia. There are lots and lots of different things which can cause these difficulties. So things like, for example, having a vitamin B12 deficiency can cause problems. Having an underactive thyroid can also cause a slowness in thinking. So it's important that we try and identify anything like that first, and hence why those blood tests are really important. We do a range of different cognitive tests. So this is usually done with one of our psychologists, and they will test different aspects of memory and thinking. It's really helpful to do this early, because what would happen is you'll look to see if there's a pattern of problems picked up on those tests, and the pattern of difficulties that you see on those tests can help determine what type of dementia the person might have. We also do brain scans. Within our clinic, we tend to do MRI scans, which use big magnets, and they take quite detailed pictures of the brain itself. It's also really important to do a scan to look for anything else that might be going on, which could be causing problems with memory. So, for example, a brain tumour would be something that we'd want to check to make sure there's no evidence of. In some cases, we do some other specialist tests. One of them is a lumbar puncture test. What this involves is inserting a very fine needle between the bones of the back, below the spinal cord, and we take a sample of spinal fluid. And when we send that sample off, we can measure some of the proteins involved in Alzheimer's disease, and it can help us refine our diagnosis. So what this test does is basically helps us work out, does this person have Alzheimer's disease or not? This is a specialist investigation. It tends to only be offered by neurology services, so psychiatrists wouldn't usually have access to this sort of test. However, an important point I wish to make is that you don't have to have a lumbar puncture to make a diagnosis of dementia. And of course, if someone did have a lumbar puncture and it was negative for the Alzheimer's proteins, what you're basically able to tell the person is that it's extremely unlikely to have Alzheimer's, but it doesn't really tell you what else could be happening. And hence why you would then need to think about other investigations and tests if the diagnosis is still not very clear. So I'm now going to talk about the different types of dementia. So the most common one is Alzheimer's. And I've got a few different pictures on the screen for you to have a look at. So if you look at the one on the left, you'll see on the left picture, you've got some normal brain tissue there. So you've got the brain cells there. Then if you look at the picture just to the right of it, the Alzheimer's picture, you'll see there's a few other things going on. So we've got some amyloid plaques outside the brain cells. So the amyloid is an abnormal protein that becomes sticky and forms these clumps and plaques in people with Alzheimer's disease. And we also have what we call neurofibrillary tangles. So these are a different type of protein that becomes abnormal and forms these knots and tangles inside cells. This disrupts how the cells work and they die as a result. So that's kind of what's happening at a microscopic level. If you look at the middle picture, you'll see two brain slices. You've got the healthy brain on the left, and then you've got a brain slice from someone who had advanced Alzheimer's on the right. And you can clearly see there's a massive difference in terms of the size of the brain. You'll also notice, just see if my cursor is going to appear, so there's a central cavity called a ventricle, which is much larger in the Alzheimer's brain. And if you look below that, you'll see that again, you've got a lot of brain tissue loss there. So round here is where the hippocampus sits, which, as I mentioned, is really important for memory and thinking. We've got a picture of the hippocampus on the very right of the screen. It's called the hippocampus because it looks like a seahorse. Now, the hippocampus is the part of the brain that is usually affected first in people with Alzheimer's disease. So the first symptoms that people tend to have are difficulties with their memory, particularly their short-term memory. Other symptoms that people may have include a repetition in conversation. The person may tell someone things that they've already said not so long ago. It can also cause some language problems, so they may have word finding problems, or they may have difficulties with misplacing items. They may keep losing their glasses, their keys. They may also have some other difficulties around the home, for example, leaving the hob on or going out and leaving the door unlocked. More symptoms will develop over time as more parts of the brain start to become affected by the Alzheimer's disease. Now, how we go about treating Alzheimer's, there are some medications which can be used to help improve quality of life and improve symptoms. So these, what they do is they boost the level of a particular chemical in the brain that's important for memory and thinking. They work in about 50% of people. Not everyone benefits from them. But the purpose of them is to improve quality of life. They don't slow the progress of the illness. Okay. So that was a brief overview of Alzheimer's. The second most common type of dementia we see is vascular dementia. And actually, this also does tend to overlap a little bit with Alzheimer's. So sometimes people will get a diagnosis of mixed dementia, and often what we're referring to is a combination of Alzheimer's and vascular disease. So there's lots of emerging research showing that these conditions are actually linked. And the amyloid sticky protein I mentioned on the previous slide, you can actually get in blood vessels as well, and it can cause a more sort of vascular dementia. So there's quite a bit of overlap. I find vascular dementia one of the easiest types of dementia to teach medical students about because actually a lot of the sort of underlying disease process is very similar to what happens in things like stroke and heart disease. Essentially, in vascular dementia, what's happening is you're getting diseased blood vessels. when they become diseased, they don't work as well. So the blood supply to the brain is not as good. And as a result of that, different parts of the brain start to become deprived of oxygen and other nutrients, and they become damaged as a result. And you can see on the screen, on the slide I've got up now, a scan from a brain, someone who has vascular dementia. And you can, I think, quite clearly see there's quite a lot of white change happening around the middle of the scan, so just outside those black central areas, the ventricles I mentioned before. So this is all brain damage that's due to the blood supply being compromised. Risk factors for vascular dementia are the same as they are for things like heart disease and stroke. So having diabetes, having high blood pressure, high cholesterol, being a smoker, excess alcohol, a sedentary lifestyle, all those things contribute to an individual's risk of getting vascular dementia, as well as, of course, heart disease and all those other sorts of conditions. This is why looking after your heart health is also very much applicable to brain health. So keeping these sorts of things in check with your GP is really important. Symptoms of vascular dementia are going to vary depending on which part of the brain has become affected by the disease. However, people often do have difficulties with concentration. They may find their decision-making ability is impaired, and their information processing speed can be much slower than what it perhaps was before. So really the key point here is that people with vascular dementia may not necessarily present with problems of their memory like they do in Alzheimer's disease, though that can happen, of course. The way we pick up vascular dementia would primarily be through doing a brain scan and looking to see how much blood vessel disease and damage there is in the brain. Again, vascular dementia also gets worse over time. And when you have further vascular events, so when you're having further damage to the brain caused by the blood supply being compromised, you start to develop new symptoms and problems over time. There aren't any treatments licensed for vascular dementia. Really, the way to manage it is clinically is to try and keep these vascular risk factors tightly controlled. So making sure that if there's high blood pressure, that's treated, making sure that blood sugars are well maintained in someone who is diabetic. That's the sort of the mainstay treatment for this condition. The third type of dementia I wish to talk about is Lewy body dementia. So this doesn't overlap with Parkinson's disease, which I'm sure many of you will have heard of or come across. So Parkinson's disease is another degenerative condition where people have lots of difficulties and problems with movement, and one of the characteristic things they can have is a pill rolling tremor. Now in Lewy body dementia, what happens is you get another abnormal protein developing. So this is a protein called alpha-synuclein. We don't really know what it does. We know it exists and it's important for brain cell function. What we do know is that in this type of dementia, it becomes abnormal, and much like the amyloid, it forms clumps and lumps within the brain. Now, when you get these abnormal proteins developing in the brain stem, which I mentioned before, that tends to cause a more sort of Parkinson's disease picture. However, if you start to get those Lewy bodies forming in the other parts of the brain that are responsible for cognition, then you can start to develop dementia with Lewy bodies instead. Much like the other types of dementia, you get brain cell death. And I've already mentioned it is part of the Parkinson's disease spectrum. So often you can have patients who have not only the cognitive difficulties, but they may also have some features of Parkinson's disease as well. So I've got Parkinson's disease. So I've got some of the clinical features there that we'd look for in a physical examination. In terms of the other symptoms, actually one of the most striking features that we find in people with Lewy body disease is that they can have quite significant fluctuations in their cognitive function. So they may have periods of the day where their cognition is really affected, their concentration is very poor, they're struggling to process information. But then there can be other parts of the day where it's very different. Their cognitive function is much better and they're much more alert. Another striking thing which we see in people with Lewy body disease is hallucinations. These tend to be visual hallucinations, and they tend to be quite complex in nature. What I mean by that is people often see things like animals or people. Sometimes people actually don't mind having these hallucinations. They accept them for what they are. Other people may become distressed by them. Whether or not someone is distressed by these symptoms is used to determine whether we need to go ahead and try and treat that problem or not. Sometimes people can also develop delusions. So there's a particular syndrome called Capgras syndrome, which we've seen in a few of our patients in clinic. This isn't unique to Lewy body dementia. It can occur in things like schizophrenia as well. Capgras syndrome is where a person believes that a person, usually someone that's quite close to them, such as a family member, has been replaced by an imposter. It's a really interesting syndrome. As you can imagine, it's incredibly distressing for the person who holds that delusional belief, but it can also, of course, be very upsetting for the family member that's implicated in this delusional belief. I've mentioned already that people can have movement problems related to the Parkinson's part of the illness. People can also have quite significant sleep problems. So there's a condition called REM behavioural disorder. What happens towards the later part of the night is we enter REM sleep, which is where you have rapid eye movements which are occurring underneath the eyelids as we sleep. This is the part of sleep where people will tend to dream and be able to recall those dreams. Ordinarily, the brain is very clever and it essentially paralyzes the body when you're in REM sleep so that you don't act out your dreams. In people who are developing Parkinson's and Lewy body dementia, that system goes wrong and the body isn't paralyzed during REM sleep. And what that means is that people start acting out their dreams. So they may have lots of violent thrashing movements, perhaps during the later part of the night. If someone has REM behavioural disorder and they've also got problems with their memory and thinking, then we'd really be very suspicious of something like Lewy body dementia. In terms of treating this type of dementia, actually some of the medications for Alzheimer's can be helpful, both in terms of the improving cognition, but also for treating the hallucinations that people experience. The final type of dementia I want to talk about is frontotemporal dementia. So we see this less commonly, and actually again, it's very much an umbrella term. There are many, many different types of frontotemporal dementia. It also tends to occur in younger patients. So when I say younger, I mean people who are below the age of 65. It again is associated with a whole host of different proteins that become abnormal and affect brain cell function, leading to brain cell death. Interestingly, frontotemporal dementia, or FTD as I will call it, is more likely to be associated with genetic mutations. So these are spelling mistakes in the DNA. If someone comes to our clinic and we think they have FTD, one of the things that we may do is offer them a genetic test to look for a specific mutation associated with FTD. Obviously, that can have significant implications for family members, particularly children and siblings. So we do liaise with a genetic counselling service as well as part of ongoing care. Importantly, if the person doesn't have a genetic mutation that's associated with FTD, that doesn't mean they haven't got FTD. It could be that they have an FTD due to a different genetic mutation that we just don't know about yet. In terms of how FTD presents, so broadly speaking, If the front part of the brain is affected, the frontal lobe, then that will tend to cause more a sort of behavioural problem. If it's affecting the temporal lobe, it tends to cause more sort of a language difficulty. That's quite a broad simplification. I'm going to just give you a few more examples of symptoms, though, according to that. So the behavioural variants, what can happen is people can become apathetic. They may become disinhibited and behave inappropriately in social situations. So actually, often with this type of dementia, the patient may not always really have much insight into what's happening. It's often another family member or a friend who may have noticed that there's something not quite right. They're just not behaving quite the same as they were before. With a language variant of FTD, as I said, with this, you're going to start having problems with word finding difficulty. Their speech may become affected. It may become much more hesitant and non-fluent, or telegraphic is a term that we would sometimes use clinically. Again, with FTD, so there aren't any licensed treatments for this at all, but that doesn't mean there's nothing we can do. There are some medication which can be helpful, and depending on what type of difficulty or problem the person has, that will help us determine what sort of treatments we need to offer. We do also work with other services. So, for example, it can sometimes be very helpful to have speech and language therapy referrals put in as well to help, particularly for those who've got language difficulties. So what I'm hoping I've demonstrated here is that dementia is a very broad term. There are lots of different diseases, lots of different causes of dementia, and they affect people in very different ways. It's not just a case of someone's more forgetful. The most important question, therefore, when meeting someone with dementia is trying to understand what type of dementia they have, because that will determine what problems and symptoms they have day to day. So what can you do to help someone with dementia? I tend to use this for teaching medical students, actually, when they are meeting people with dementia. People with dementia can often be very distracted by other things going on around them, and they may find it hard to concentrate on what you're saying. So being in a quiet environment where there's not lots of competing noise can be really helpful in helping that person to pay attention to what you are trying to tell them. Speaking clearly is important, and also trying to avoid raising your voice. So sometimes people may get irritated, perhaps because I have to repeat something a few times, and their voice starts to get louder, and people walk away and think, well, it doesn't matter, they've got dementia, so they won't remember anyway. But actually, okay, although the person may not remember exactly what you had said to them, the emotional content of what you've said can really stick with them, and they may associate that sort of feeling upset and angry at being shouted at with you when they see you in future. So just because someone has dementia does not mean that it's okay to shout at them and just think, oh, it doesn't matter, they'll forget, because that emotion will stay with the person. And they may spend the rest of that day feeling very upset and angry and may not really remember why. Being patient, obviously, is really important. The use of humour is an interesting one. I think this is one of those points where it's very much about letting the person with dementia take the lead. If they're laughing about their mistake or misunderstanding, I think it's really good and helpful to laugh and have a joke with them about it. If the person is getting really upset and distressed by their mistake, of course, then that probably isn't a good time to be laughing about it. Using simple language is helpful. I think this, again, very much depends on the person that you've got in front of you. So just because someone has dementia doesn't mean that they can't use complicated language. It's about tailoring how you speak to someone according to how they're presenting. Trying to avoid asking too many questions. Asking one question at a time is helpful. And of course, explaining things in different ways. can be really helpful, or giving information in a different format. So, for example, having something down in writing that the person can then later refer to. And finally, it's also okay to ask people what they find helpful. So, in summary, the key points I think I'd like people to take away from this is that it's important to find out what type of dementia someone has. It's important to find out how it affects that individual, because that will vary very much. Even if someone does have Alzheimer's disease, it could be affecting other things that perhaps you haven't thought about. And also find out what is helpful for them. I think that's something that patients really do appreciate. I would just like to thank Brace, who support and fund a lot of our research, Greg Lash and Solicitors for allowing me to give a talk today, and also the Medical Research Council, who fund my salary each month. So I'm now going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to hand over to Heledd to give her talk.
Yeah, so good morning from me, and it's very much a case of, as Mark said at the beginning, I come here today in two capacities. One, I am a trustee of Brace, which means that sort of help support the charity in its endeavours to raise funds to help research into dementia. But secondly, I'm a solicitor, and my role as a solicitor is one very much of how do I support people who have illnesses such as dementia, can be Parkinson's, can be other issues. But given we're talking today about dementia and how that impacts upon capacity to manage people's lives, what do we do as solicitors, and what can we do for those who have dementia to support them and put in the scaffolding? And I think listening to James and looking at those slides is really interesting to sort of get a feel for the different types of dementia and the different impact that they have on the individual. And I think also what's really important is to be aware that there's generally a person with dementia, but there's often people supporting them. There may be family members, friends, that there are clinicians. There's a whole cast of people that are working with that person with dementia. And every person with dementia is a person with dementia. It is an illness. It is an illness that affects people and does affect people differently. I think that's really important to remember, because what I do when I'm talking to clients and meeting clients is sitting down with them going, right, well, we know you've got an illness, and it's not pleasant, and we know that there are things that are going to be done, but what can I do to help support you scaffolding what your future looks like? So what do you need to have in place to make sure that your journey with this illness for you and your family is as easy as possible? So some of the things that people will be concerned about is what does the dementia mean for them? Are they going to be struggling to look after themselves? Are they going to be struggling to cope? Will they be struggling to manage their finances? Will they be struggling over health issues? What does health mean to that person? And what can we do to sort of smooth that journey as much as possible? So we all know that, being a grown-up is quite tiring at times, and you've got lots of things to manage. You've got to sort of manage your own life. You've got to manage a household. You may be paying bills. You may be paying a mortgage. You may be supporting another family member. You may be wanting to look to your future, looking to what your legacy is for your children and maybe grandchildren and maybe other relatives. And there will be a lot of questions that people will have about what they can do. We know that dementia is an illness that it can take quite a long time to have an impact, and we're beginning to understand, as James has sort of eloquently put, the impact of those different types of dementia have on your ability to manage your affairs. So what are the things that I will be talking to somebody that when I get the phone call and saying, I've been given a diagnosis of dementia, or Dad's had a diagnosis of dementia, sometimes the conversation starts that way. what sort of things will I want to be talking to people about? So I think the sort of, it splits to me into three sort of areas. I think the first area is what a lot of people think about is, that's it, I've got an illness, and what happens when I die? And it'll make people think about their wills. So getting a will in place, a lot of people worry about making wills. It's pretty miserable thing to think about. Nobody wants to think about dying, and I appreciate that. It's not much fun, but actually all you're doing is saying, well, when I'm not here to tell people what I want to do, this is what I want to happen. And for some people, that's making sure that their funeral arrangements are what they want. For some people, it's making sure that their spouse is well looked after, their children get what they're entitled to, that they've got friends that they have been kind to them. Some people want to leave money to charity. So these are all opportunities for people to want to set in motion and get their paperwork in order. So first conversation will often start about what does my will look like? And a will is a really important starting point for opening that dialogue. When you're no longer here, what do you want to happen? Do you have a spouse that needs to be looked after? Do you have children who have expectations? What does that look like? So very often the first conversation I will have with somebody is, tell me about yourself. Tell me about your life and what's important to you. And coming to the end of that conversation can be quite helpful, because people will then say, okay, I'm quite comfortable, I've sorted out my affairs, I know that my wife, my husband, my children are going to be looked after, I've done the right thing, and I can rest easy. But then I think what the conversation we start off with is going, great, well, that's fine, that's when you're no longer here, but what about now? What about while you are on this journey with this illness? Who do you want to be helping you on the way? So you've got your family members, you've got your friends, you've got your professional support network in the clinicians, in the doctors, in the nurses, possibly it's in carers coming in, or maybe that's something that you're concerned about in the future. And that's where powers of attorney will come in. So there are, very briefly, there are two types of power of attorney. There's one that allows you to nominate a trusted person to make decisions about your finances, which means that that person can help run your bank accounts, help you with shopping, help you with bills, things that actually, quite frankly, a lot of us find quite tedious anyway, but with an illness like dementia might become more difficult and more confusing. Putting in place a power of attorney for finances means that you've got a trusted person or people who know what they can and can't do for you. And actually, a lot of the time, it's having that dialogue with those people about, what do you want as a family? If somebody's stepping up and managing your finances, what does that look like? It is often so much more than just filling in a form on a piece of paper, because it's a really important conversation that you need to have about, what does this mean in reality? The second type of power of attorney that you can create is one where you nominate people to make decisions about your health. If you are losing the capacity to verbalise and vocalise and communicate what treatment you want, or perhaps treatment you don't want, have you got that? Have you given somebody that voice for you? More importantly, does that person you've given the voice know what it is important to you? Do they know what you like and dislike? Do they know what you would find tolerable and intolerable? Do they know what treatment you would happily accept? Do they know what you would find very difficult? And that is an exceptionally personal decision. And it's actually a very hard conversation to have. I've facilitated numbers of these conversations over the years with family members, because I'm independent, and I will ask the difficult questions. I will say to somebody who's making a power of attorney, who's maybe had the diagnosis, and say, how do you feel about invasive treatment? How do you feel about maybe operations? How do you feel about things like blood transfusions? oh, I hadn't really thought about that. Well, let's start this dialogue. Let's talk to your doctor, your nurse, your GP, your clinician, your family about these conversations. Far better to have them now than while we can have this conversation sensibly and calmly, rather than in a panic when perhaps things become very stressful. And anybody who's been in hospital for any sort of operation knows that it's very difficult to have quiet and sensible conversations. And I know I've been there personally, and actually having had really important conversations beforehand makes things a lot easier. You're taking a heat out of a situation. You can subsidise or supplement powers of attorney with what they call advanced statements. These are not legally binding documents, but they are an indication of things that are important to you. I've had clients who've used this as an opportunity to say, well, if I had to go into care, I would want to have this type of care home and this type of amenities, and it's really important to me that I'd have access to a garden, and it'd be really important that I could have a pet, and very small things that actually can make a huge difference. Powers of attorney are legally binding documents, and if you have given somebody the authority under that legally binding document, you have an advocate, you have a person who can speak on your behalf, who has weight behind that authority. It is more than just a piece of paper. But what is really helpful is to supplement and subsidize all that information and all that role you're giving somebody by telling them what's important to you. What's important to me might not be important to somebody else. It might be, and I have found this, very difficult conversations start within the family. I can give you a very practical example in my family. I'm Welsh, you may guess with the name, but we, in Wales, the automatic organ donation came in a number of years ago. It's only just come in England this year. And my parents have been married best part of sort of 55 years, and we were talking about it. And my mother, for the first time in my father's life, just turned around and went, "Don't you dare do organ donation." And it was a complete shock. He had absolutely no idea. And we had a really interesting and important dialogue about why it was important to her that that wasn't something we just did without thinking. And so for me and for my family, it opened up lots of dialogue. Thankfully, because of this prompted conversation, a couple of years later, when my dad had the classic, we had the phone call, we had the ambulance, he ended up in hospital with sepsis. We'd had lots of conversations about what health care looked like. Thankfully, he's fine now, but I had the power of attorney, and I didn't need to invoke it, but we knew what was important to him, and we were able to facilitate that care for him. So really important to have the conversations around the documents as well as putting them in place. And the final thing, I think, a lot of the conversations that I have with clients is about what does good care look like for you in the future. I'm not going to get into any sort of politics at the moment, but we've all seen in the news recently what's been going on in care homes and what care homes have had to live with. And these are people's homes. Sometimes people get to the point where their illness is so severe that they cannot stay at home. And that means going into a care home where they get given care. And the way that the system works in this country is very much that unless you are funded by the NHS, and by and large you are in hospital, although there are exceptions to the rule, you are probably going to be self-funding. Now, that can put an enormous strain on a family. That can put an enormous worry on a family about what does that mean for me? What does it mean for my spouse? What does this mean for all the plans I have for my children and my grandchildren? And sometimes all these things are intertwined. So we can sit down with clients and say, well, we can look at how care works. I can tell you what the legalities are, but let's look at what is important to you. What is important to you and empowerment, and how do we manage the conversation about care fees? It might never happen. It might happen. And if it does, what do you need to have in place to make that easy and straightforward, and you don't put your nearest and dearest under a huge amount of strain, struggling to find the answers at a time of a crisis. And I think that, as James says, what type of dementia or illness are we talking about? What's the prognosis? What's the treatment? Are you living really well with dementia? Are you managing those symptoms? Or are you looking at somebody who is much further down the line, who perhaps needs an awful lot more care and support? And you're talking about a couple of months or a year perhaps of care and support. Do you have everything in place that you need in your toolkit to facilitate that being an easy journey? It's never going to be an easy journey. Dementia is an illness, such as cancer is an illness, and all these other umbrella terms are illnesses. And simply because it is not immediately visible doesn't mean it's not going to have a significant impact. What is the effect of the type of dementia that you have been diagnosed with, or your loved one has been diagnosed with? What does this mean on the ground in the reality? And what are you going to find helpful? Are you going to find it helpful to have a power of attorney in place, that you've got somebody who can then go and get the right advice how you pay for those care fees? Are you going to find it helpful that you've got somebody who's got power of attorney who can phone up the bank and make those payments for the gas bills? Are you going to find it helpful to have a power of attorney in place who knows what you want if you are incapable of voicing your own concerns and fears because your capacity is affected sufficiently that you can't speak for yourself? So what I do, and I am a lawyer, and so I give legal advice, we give support to people to put in place what it is they need. Let us put in the scaffolding, give people a toolkit so they are equipped to deal with the diagnosis that they've had. Whichever dementia it is, some of the toolkit's very same, but the conversation is exceptionally different. So I think it's planning is better than crisis management. I think that applies across whichever industry you're in. And I would really say that that's something we can absolutely help with. Myself, other lawyers, this is what we do. So I'm conscious we've got lots of questions coming in. So I'm happy to sort of move on to that section of the talk. So over to you, I think, Mark.
Hello, I'll jump in and just put some questions to you, if that's all right. We've had lots come through and lots of interesting comments, so thank you for those. So just one for Heledd before we move on to an earlier one, just a quick one. Who can sign LPAs?
So the LPA has to be signed by the person making the power of attorney. So if I want a power of attorney, it has to be me signing it and my attorneys. I can't sign on behalf of somebody else. So if somebody hasn't got a power of attorney in place and doesn't understand what it is, unfortunately you're looking at making an application to court, which is pretty time consuming and pretty expensive and exhausting, quite frankly. So powers of attorney, and the idea is empowering people. It has to be the person who creates it, signs it.
Thank you, Heledd. And just one for Mark, I think, actually. Let me just find, it's an earlier question. So Kelvin's asked, what does Bryce do for the BAME community to break down the stigma of dementia and that they show diversity?
We're actually working quite hard on this. It's very much behind the scenes at the moment, but I hope this will produce more public fruits in the next year or so. I'm a member of the Bristol BAME Dementia Working Group. I've got the words in the right order. There's quite a lot of them. This brings together dementia specialist organisations, which are both charity and public sector, with groups representing some of the major BAME and other ethnic minority communities in Bristol. So there's a Chinese community organisation, there's an African Caribbean care group, there's a Somali care organisation and a South Asian community and care group there. And we're working at, for example, how to create public meetings to relay important information about dementia diagnosis and care and support, how to overcome some of the language barriers and sometimes cultural barriers, just sort of very simple things about when a meeting might be arranged and how you publicize it, what kind of building it might be in, and so on. And gradually, some important initiatives are coming out of this. Unfortunately, we have one or two planned for this summer, which have been knocked on the head by the current COVID crisis. So that is a delaying factor. I should add that Brace is a very small charity. There are just 6 staff, fully stretched. And while we don't have the resources ourselves to take the lead in this and provide everything that we'd like to, what we tend to do is network, bring together different groups who can provide the expertise from their resources. Just to give you one example of how I can see something very constructive happening, we are working with, we are funding the research of 2 Chinese scientists in Plymouth, actually. And because they're native speakers of either Cantonese or Mandarin, that opens up the possibility of having a public meeting at which they themselves will be able to address without translators some of the Chinese community for whom English is a second, third language, or even not really a language at all. So that kind of potential is what we're working with.
I know we are just over 11 o'clock, but just one more question for Heledd. How much does it cost for a will? That might be something you want to come back to later, but more importantly, how does so cost for a will and both LPAs to be put in place, and how does this compare to the costs and stress involved with not getting it done before it's too late?
Yeah, so I mean, like most things, how much the piece of string, cost wise. What I would say is perhaps the time cost and the distress cost of not having these things in place is pretty significant. If you don't have a power of attorney in place and you want to make decisions for somebody who lacks capacity, the only people who have the ability to make that decision is the court. You may have heard of the court of protection. It's often quite in the news, and it makes big decisions for people. It might not be the decision you want. There's a sort of a fairly traumatic case a couple of years ago, and he was a police officer, young hale and hearty, he'd been in the army, was on his way to work on his motorbike one day and got hit off his bike by somebody who was just driving recklessly. And he'd been one of those people who had the conversation. He said, if I'm ever, I've been in the army, I'm a police officer, I've seen it all. Just I don't want to be in that position of being kept alive unnecessarily. And he didn't have anything in place. He didn't have a power of attorney in place. He didn't have an advance decision, sometimes known as a living will, in place. And the court spent weeks and months deciding what should happen to him. And his family were all of one opinion and said this isn't what he wanted. And there was competing interests, whether he was going to come out of the coma, what that looked like. But the really important thing that came out of that case was the judge said, had he had that power of attorney in place, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be talking about this. We've had to hear both sides of the story. We've had to hear all the arguments. Had he put those in place, that would be it. We wouldn't have this conversation, and nobody would have had to go through the distress of having to come to court and effectively arguing about this person. So a cost question, it is going to cost money. Whichever way you look at it, costs will vary depending on what people want. The emotional cost and the emotional distress can be significantly worse, I say. So do at least consider getting this in place and getting the right advice. It's very much about getting in front of the right people at the right time to get the right advice, and that could be such a real life changer in the future.
Thank you, Heledd. That's all our questions, I think. So, Mark, back over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jo. I think that brings our webinar to a conclusion. So just leaves it for me to say a few thank yous. Thank you, first of all, to our two speakers, James and Heledd. I've heard them both speak before on occasion, so I knew they'd be excellent, and you both were. Thank you very much. I'm sure that there'll be questions people will think of, by the way, that they wish they'd asked and they didn't. There will be an email follow-up that will include contact details. Please do come back to us. I'm bound to say, as the manager of a fundraising charity, that if you've been inspired by by the work that James is doing, or if you want to help us bring more of these public information events to people, we do depend totally on the support of the general public. So please do go to our website or contact me to find out how you can help us. And finally, thank you everybody for being here and playing your part, especially those of you who've asked questions and helped to widen the conversation a bit. Thank you very much, and I hope we'll see many of you again.